Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for making the time to join us at our second of our Collaboraculture workshops. So if you can remember from the first workshop, we're bringing people together across the whole of the wine and the ag tech and the mapping kind of technology ecosystems to collaboratively create an open vineyard data model. And we're doing this as a part of a kind of a foundational piece towards creating interoperable spatial technology for our industry. So in these series of workshops, we're going to be bringing experts in from different fields to share their knowledge and how their knowledge from other industries can apply to help us to map our vineyards. If you can remember, and if you're part of workshop one, we had Emily coming in from Shared Streets, and she demonstrated like how they would use their approach to mapping the curbsides of the world and how that could be applied to vineyards. And this is something, just to let you know, that we plan to kind of pick up as a part of these workshops. So we're planning to bring Emily back in a future workshop and actually work with everybody here to start to demonstrate that actually being like practically applied. So again, if you can cast your mind back to the last workshop about a month ago, one of the other presenters was John Bryant. So he's our GIS expert in residence for the project. And he presented about how we can create both a conceptual and logical data model of a vineyard. And in this workshop today, we're going to start on the conceptual side. So I just wanted to say a big thank you. There's a couple of other growers on their way in, but I wanted to say a massive thank you. There's a whole load of growers, like there's a couple of Bens here, and there's Ian as well, who's kind of come all the way from Clare to be a part of this. And it's really important that this isn't something that's just kind of led by the technology industry, but this is actually led by vineyard managers and growers from all different sizes of vineyards. So we really appreciate you making the effort to come here today. As you'll see, we're going to run this workshop in two sections. So just at the start, we're going to have a couple of presentations. Again, from people who are coming in from different perspectives. This first presenter, Peter Hayes, was actually recommended by Gaia, who are one of the partners in the project. So Peter has kind of over 30 years of experience since graduating from UC Davis in California in the wine industry. He's been kind of the chief viticulturist of Victoria at one stage. You were also the manager of viticulture and grower liaison for Southport before it came Treasury. And Peter's going to be talking to us today from his role as honorary president of OIV. So, and this is actually one of the things that came out of the workshop as feedback, is that we need to ensure that we're working and using, like taking a global approach so that we're doing things here in Australia and doing them in a way that as we develop this data model, it could apply to anywhere in the world. And actually, Peter's here, who actually works for a global wine organization, to start to share with us like the insights of how standards in wine globally get created, and also hopefully some kind of initial ideas of how we might, as a part of this project, as one of the next steps, actually approach the OIV to see if what we're doing can actually start to be recognized as something that gets rolled out globally. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Peter. Thank you so much for making your time. I'm going to just bear with me for a second. I'm going to switch slides. And I'll just share screen again so we can bring this up. Great. So, yeah, you just progress on that one there.
Thanks very much, Ollie. And it's great to see the crowd here and maybe the crowd somewhere out there in the vast universe. I'm certainly excited, but equally I'm impressed to see this initiative given, as Ollie said, I've seen 30 plus, well, it's perhaps more like 40 years if I dare think about that far back. of engagement one way or the other with the wine industry in particular and the horticulture and irrigation industries more generally. In coming to grips then with this, I've been forced to reflect on exactly these questions. How could the Collaboraculture project link into OIV's work? Is there opportunity to collaborate via or with the OIV to create technical standards around vineyard mapping? And what could we action as next steps if appropriate? I'll try to respond to those questions that Ollie set for me over the last week or so. We had a chat 2 weeks ago in a rather nice evening and glass of wine on the veranda. And I'll have to say that I think there's genuine prospects. So without forecasting an outcome, I've raised it with my colleagues in the Paris-based organisation to see where we might be able to at least utilise the generally good offices of the OIV in supporting via background connections with their government members and in turn the organisations within those within the purview of those governments. So, to explain, if you like, unmute myself, it says here, is this muted?
Oh, if you could keep yourself on mute because we're hearing you through the microphone.
Almost I'll only touch an arrow. So, to explain quickly, the OIV is an intergovernmental organisation. It's made up of volunteered governments across the world, established in 1924, reconstituted in the early 2000s, currently with 47 country members across 5 continents, and covers about 85% of world wine production. We lost the US and Canada and Denmark somewhere in the late 90s where they couldn't agree with the way the old world system was working and they weren't patient enough to wait for the new constitution. Suffice to say, the OIV remains an intergovernmental organisation, so working via consensus. It doesn't move as rapidly as some organisations or countries would like, but it does actually move over time. And I think I've got enough evidence to say it's better to be involved than it is to be running your own agenda, notwithstanding the nationalist views of some leadership around the world as we're seeing. So I won't dwell on who the members are, why they're there. We certainly have observers out of China, but not the People's Republic of China as such, although they've translated the code, the Enological Code of OIV. So that's one of the ones that's been adopted and translated by China, for example, as their working reference. So the role of the OIV was and remains pretty much the same as it was back at the start, although in the early days it was very much protecting members' interests. It's now extended rather more to be very considerate of the consumer and the world's sort of health and environmental issues that are out there. But essentially 3 pillars: information to inform its members of measures whereby the concerns of all those parties may be taken into consideration. It has a strong focus on collaboration, which aligns very much here to assist other international organisations and especially those carrying out standardisation activities. And in the event that you cannot standardise, at least to harmonise. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of those 2 elements to contribute to the international harmonisation of existing practices and standards and to prepare new international standards as appropriate to improve conditions for producing and marketing wine products. arrow's not responsive. I won't fiddle anymore. Our operating medium is via expert groups. So the people involved in this are nominees, approved delegates from their country as either experts in their own right or delegates representing broader interests and governments. So I've variously mixed it up being an expert or a delegate or being confused as to what my real role is in a number of these. And I've certainly worked with Ev's colleagues of the past, Nigel Scott, for example, and others in the interim in presenting perspectives from experts in Australia, in recruiting experts from Australia. And we have, for example, a strong representation, not a big one, working on a number of the expert groups with the OIV. But essentially, it's an iterative process whereby we work with a strategic plan, set priorities that might be of concern to all the constituent members and their accountable bodies and their constituents. And people will float up concepts such as this one for consideration and acceptance to be a priority project. And it works through a number of iterations, which may take 10 years in some instances and never generate a resolution, or it might go through in as short as perhaps a couple of years. And in the event that, for example, we struggle with coming to a broadly agreed by consensus at intergovernmental level agreement around standards or recommendations or resolutions, we can at least put out in most instances an information package, a considered expertise document. So we have that around a number of the things, including one around irrigation best practice, another around functional biodiversity in the vineyard, for example, is a recent one. The irrigation one is yet to be published, but was completed back in May or June. Do we have credible people in there? They're intended to be industry relevant experts nominated by government. They are, I guess, confounded in a sense by the slow process. So unlike scientific forums, the OIV is a scientific and technical reference group, but then has this political interface and regulatory interface. So unlike a free to disclose and free to operate scientific forum, our scientific experts are real, but they are then constrained by this step process in terms of determining a resolution. But to illustrate, and some of these names will be known to you, the chair of Viticulture Commission, so we work via commissions, is Vitorino Novello, who's well known to many around quite a few of the areas from the Italian university system. Benjamin Bois is in Burgundy, is a specialist around terroir. Mario de la Puente used to be working for the OIV as the chief of one of the Spanish interprofessional groups. Let's go to other. Hans Schultz is the director and vice chancellor of Geisenheim and would be known as a speaker in Australia at conferences. Antonio Gaia runs the SOGRAP Portuguese private entity R&D function, but also is nationally engaged in their R&D collaborative works. So we have credible scientists, technical specialists as experts in the OIV, and they are keenly interested in things like this sort of proposal. So my little asterisk, 2 nights ago, I sent a note to each of those saying, how would we see this sort of project promoted for consideration and facilitation in an international sense? I will come back with a further point to make about that. So the sorts of standards that are promulgated will include the Code of Descriptive Characteristics of Vines and Varieties, to which are now added a number of the molecular marker codes. This is worked in conjunction with outfits like UPOV, the Union for Protection of Varieties, So again, it tends to be collaborative in some of these areas, whereas the description of world wine varieties and their naming, including that list of synonyms of wine varieties, is one where the intersection between national interest and technical ampelography sits. So member countries control the list of synonyms because they're important for trade, whereas if we're exchanging plant material, description of the base variety and the way in which it's described is very much arranged at the scientific and technical level. So I'll leave this question. I've got two questions up here and I'll make some suggestions. The other thing of importance in recruiting, particularly the EU side of things, which after all is still the dominant producer of wines and leads a lot of thought, I guess, when it comes to New World countries like South America and South Africa. The EU has by default declared the OIV as their technical reference group for any of their regulations. So the first of the calls upon consideration for regulatory suggestions and advice around policy will be the position of the OIV when it comes to grape and wine and grape-derived products. Hence, as the OIV does not have the EU as a member but has individual member states, any collaborations and understanding of developments in the EU have a multiplicative sort of power. It can amplify the sort of impact. So Ollie left me with two questions. What other actions? Well, in Australia, I see prospects for the broadened and consolidated links with standards setting and standards managing organisations like Geoscience Australia. And I see on their website, they have active links with several other organisations, particularly around geocoding, geo-related coding, but also things like Standards Australia. And for example, I was the convener for the Grapevine Propagation Material Standard, which is published under Standards Australia approval. It costs you money to be there, but it's worth considering. The sad reality at the moment is very few people take any notice of that standard. And I think finding ways to engage with how you create reliance on standards as opposed to saying they're there and you can reject them or accept them as you like, I think is important. I think the other ones in Australia are very much the CRCs in operation, for example, SmartSat. Are there links with that one that makes sense? Or others in development like Smart Regions and elsewhere. And I did take a look, and guided by Ollie's referral, that Atlas project I think is incredibly interesting and powerful in that it sets a foundation for a whole lot of comms and data gathering and processing standards. But I note that things with the EU, it's often difficult to create a formal link because they don't fund others outside unless there's partner relationships or agreements, Australia, Germany, Australia, France, or whatever. Nevertheless, many of you have your professional and academic and technical links with others, and I think ways to generate those will be important. I draw your attention to the EU and their research and innovation framework that's in development at the moment with the Green Deal and biodiversity, and Antonio Gaia put me onto this late last week as another angle. We were chasing something else, so the serendipitous alignment is important. Take a look at that, and are there angles that you could generate there, particularly around landscape assets around vineyards? With the US, I suggest links via, again, your academic and professional and technical sort of links, but the National Grape Research Alliance is a good angle, and they have an integrated production systems program. I think Nick DeCusley and Gallo might be the convener for that one, and Nick is certainly interested in this sort of stuff. And a lesser entity, the American Vineyard Foundation. Just to close, I think whatever you can do to map, if I can plagiarise and say, map the interests of many of the others. And for example, the Group Forum that's just been conducted in the UK, and a lot of startups there, Ledley, a whole lot of others that have very similar interests. So noting that Atlas has the likes of Class and John Deere involved, there's cloud at the big end, but then you also run risk of proprietorial overreach, or just they're sufficiently independent. I would be urging you to find ways in which the cluster of the willing can amplify their lot so that they're forever being connected to those big ones. They may be running their own agenda. So I think there's plenty of this sort of background that we could strike and roll along in conjunction with your immediate focus.
Brilliant.
Thanks very much.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Peter. I just wanted to say, like, because we have Elizabeth and myself and some of the rest of the team that are involved, and Gaia, and so we will take the time to reach out internationally. Actually, I know that there's a couple of people from California who have joined via Zoom today who are interested in looking at how this can kind of translate into their world. So yeah, we'll make those steps to reach out and share what we're doing with people, and do check out that Horizon, the Atlas project, H 2020 is fascinating to see the resources that the EU is putting behind areas such as we're working on here. So if you do have any contacts with kind of groups like us and communities like us that you know of in America or in the EU especially, please pass them on and we'll do the legwork just to reach out and share what we're up to. Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you for the introduction to Peter from the Gaia team. And actually our next speaker, who's Lachlan from Frontier SI, he was actually looped into us by Brendan at Vine Health, who's here with us today. So Vine Health are another partner in our project, and obviously are looking after and leading the wine industry from a biosecurity perspective. So Brendan flagged up a project that Frontier SI were doing with the meat and livestock industry. So and we wanted to bring Lachlan in to share the insights and learnings from a very similar project that they've done with another ag industry that we can hopefully learn from. And Frontier SI are a not-for-profit that spun out of the Spatial CRC that hopefully will be a part of a number of workshops and hopefully a part of taking this through into its rollout endpoint. We will bring them in. They're also been integrally involved in what's called the SBAS system. So that's the satellite augmentation, the positional augmentation system for Australia, which is going to help to basically make our devices sub-meter, sub-50 centimeter accurate in the coming years. So there's a workshop that we're going to do on that. So once we have mapping standards and interoperable maps in place, suddenly that's going to converge at about the same time as hopefully we're going to have actually hyper accurate consumer devices. So without further doubt, Lachlan's sharing his screen. So I'll go on mute, and Lachlan, over to you, and thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you very much, Ollie, and thanks for the introduction as well. I think you've done it better than I would have. So I'm Lachlan Hurst from Frontier SI. I'm actually the technical delivery manager for Frontier SI. My involvement in this project sort of started earlier this year, and I think speaking to Ollie and Lindsay and a few of the other project participants, we sort of agreed that there are a lot of analogies between this definition of agricultural property project that we undertook and what you're looking to do as part of the open vineyard mapping exercise as well. So hence the reason why we're here today. And it certainly sounds very interesting what you're attempting to do there, and we're keen to see where it goes. So first up, what is Frontier SI? Ollie gave a great intro, so I'll zip through this pretty quickly. So we're a collaborative, not-for-profit, partner-driven, user-led applied spatial research centre. So we came out of the CRCSI, so I guess we developed a lot of good relationships across industry, academia, and we wanted to capitalise on that once the CRC finished up, and that's where the sort of Frontier SI picked up from where the CRCSI left off. Our main purpose is to uplift the entire spatial industry. So we're not too interested in sort of trying to dominate the spatial industry. It's about raising all our partners up to sort of grow the spatial industry within Australia specifically. we like to think of ourselves as a brokering organisation. So we might be the silent partners on a lot of these projects that sort of gets people in contact with the people that they need to be talking to. So who are our partners? So we've got quite a mix of government, university and industry. So we've got quite a large number of the state governments and also the national government departments as well, such as Geoscience Australia and Department of Defence as our partners, a number of universities from Australia and New Zealand, and of course a number of industry partners, and they range from quite large industry partners such as PSMA and Fugaro to some of the smaller ones like Symbolics, which offered tremendous value, but you may not have heard of. So on to the actual project. So we were approached by the Meat Livestock Association and PSMA to flesh out the idea of what agricultural property actually is, because they see it as being a really quite core or foundational spatial data set. So agricultural property is right up there as far as valuable data sets alongside things like the cadastre, for example. And that is something that the issue is that currently there's no complete and maintained agricultural property data set for Australia. So that was the main motivation for this project. They've identified that it is a foundational spatial data set, but it doesn't actually exist in a form that is suitable at the moment. So we have things like the cadastre that define the property boundaries. There's some issues working with the cadastre. It sort of differs across a state-by-state basis, and it's managed on a state-by-state basis. And it only defines land parcels, which is different to properties, agricultural properties specifically, in the terms that we've defined them. And also there were some other nuances as well, like while there's efforts out there to go through and define different types of agricultural activity, they're not defined consistently across states or governing bodies. Also, what people want to do with this data differs considerably. So the idea is to sort of go away and create a nationally accepted definition of agricultural property and a data model that supports that definition as well. So this is where we sort of look to see what we actually started with. So MLA has their property identification codes. The biggest problem we have with the PICs is that they weren't necessarily consistent in the information that they store across jurisdictions. One of the other issues was that they didn't consistently store spatial information at all. So we found that in most cases they were recording some spatial information. So it might be a single lat longitude of like the center of a property. In other cases, it may simply be a postcode of where that property is based, and that sort of really limits what you can actually do with that data. PSMA, on the other hand, has the CAD-Lite database, which is a national cadastre database. But it does vary in quality, currency, and consistency across states and territories because they're drawing on the state-by-state cadastre data sets. And that's based on, I guess, the rates definition of the property. So it's really focused on the land parcels and not necessarily agricultural properties. I guess what we got out of it, one of the key learnings we got out of this project was that an agricultural property might be made up of multiple cadastre parcels, or a cadastre parcel may actually have multiple agricultural properties on it. Then we get on to some of the potential users of this data set. So I've got the agricultural tech industry. I'm based in Melbourne, so I'm not sharing an office with anyone at the moment, but when we did share an office, we were co-located with a group called the Digital Agricultural Services. One of their core businesses was sort of extracting crop health metrics from, say, like satellite imagery and aerial imagery and some like hyperspectral data. that was their core competency, core component that they were sort of trying to get out there. But speaking to them, they had to do a lot of grunt work to sort of start to pull together some property-based data sets. So if you were to say to a group like that, here's a nationally consistent definition of agricultural properties across Australia, that is something they would love to hear, simply because it takes away all the effort associated with trying to pull that data together for their own purposes. And the same goes for government as well. So at the moment, they need this information. They piece this data together based on the PICs that are available in the cadastre, but it's not done in a consistent manner. So the potential benefits for such an agricultural property data set are quite large, especially when you start to focus on the agricultural property level, not necessarily like the land parcel as determined by the cadastre. So how do we go about doing this project? The first step, which I haven't got there, is sort of going through and identifying the stakeholders, I guess. So in this case, the primary focus was on groups that would utilize the data or groups that will contribute to the data set itself. So in this case, we're talking groups like GA, CSIRO, a number of SMEs that would also contribute to the data and draw on this data set. So once we'd identified them, we set up a series of one-on-one interviews, and we went through and tried to understand what their use cases for the data were, and also what their thoughts on, like, what did they think an agricultural property was. And that served as providing input for the workshop. So for the workshops that we pieced together, so that going into each one of these workshops, we already had an idea about the sort of commonalities between the different stakeholders as to what they saw an agricultural property data model being. So we ended up with 3 separate workshops across Brisbane, Canberra and Perth. And a large part of it was going through and collecting feedback on the data model and agricultural property definitions that we put together based on the interviews. And I think one of the more worthwhile exercises that we took out of those workshops was getting each one of the stakeholders to run through a requirements matrix. So we basically said, for each stakeholder, how critical do you see each one of these aspects of the data model? So do you need a spatial representation? Does it need to capture this metadata or that metadata? And that allowed us to sort of quantify the importance of pieces of information that we would store within the data model itself. Following on from that, we created a survey. So we went through, revised the data model based on the workshop feedback and pieced that together in a survey just to make sure we were on the right track. And then we wrote up the report and pulled together the draft data model. And this is currently in review at the moment. The key insights we got from pulling together this data model was that the data model should align and link to the cadastre most definitely, because that's where most of the spatial data representations come from. There's also an effort to reform the way the PIC data is managed at the moment as well. So it would be ideal if we could sort of tap into that process too. We found that property boundaries are key because when we're talking about the management of agricultural property, it's done on a property by property basis, which is not necessarily a cadastre parcel definition basis. We also found that the participants, the stakeholders were interested in knowing about paddock boundaries as well, because in some cases they needed that sort of finer level of management control over their properties. So we wanted to make sure that this data model was compatible with the existing data sets out there as well. So PSMA have their CADLITE data set, which is a national sort of cadastre database. They've also got a GNAF database as well, which is a national addressing database. So that would allow us to link properties up to actual addresses, which is something fairly critical. We found that data history is important, but it wasn't the most critical aspect to a lot of people. They were, if given the preference over, are you after like a complete history of a data set, or would you prefer a more up-to-date data set? Most would say we're after a more up-to-date data set. Interesting note here is that we sort of looked at minimizing the number of stakeholders that would be contributing data to the data model itself, as this would sort of reduce the complexity of collecting the data and maintaining it as well. Privacy was a big consideration as well. Most stakeholders were okay with the idea of allowing emergency services access to the entire database, for example. But there was some concern over if one agricultural property has access to like the neighbour's agricultural property data, what conflicts could potentially arise from that situation. So while they all desired a level of open data, I think the feeling was that most people would be happy with some sort of like aggregated level of data, instead of providing like a property by property breakdown. Maybe we sort of summarize it to an LGA level, and the LGA level data is the one that is open data. Where possible, we should include as much metadata as is available, and there's a recommendation to review an ANZLIC standard that's out there at the moment to actually store this metadata as well. On to sort of the more the next steps of where this project would go. It's really looking at creating a minimum viable product that can sort of be created and maintained, and hopefully leverage some of the existing data out there as well. I'm not really expecting you to be able to read through the diagram I have on the right side there. There's a bit more of a description in the report that will be published later. But a few of the key points about the draft data model that came out of this project is that it supports this paddock parcel property relationship. So in general terms, what we came up with is that agricultural property can be made up of multiple parcels, and a parcel can also belong to multiple agricultural properties as well. Similarly, a paddock may span across multiple cadastre land parcels and vice versa too. We include ownership and management details in this data model too. That's in recognition that the people that own a specific land parcel may not be the same group that manages the agricultural activity that's happening on that land parcel as well. So that was an important inclusion within the data model. It includes spatial data as well. So we link the sort of pinkish coloured boxes on the right there as sort of links to external databases. So we're proposing that we'll link into the PSMA CAD Lite database for the cadastre level parcel definitions. But there's also some additional geospatial attributes within our own data model for the parcel definitions and the paddock definitions as well. This data model came out to be maybe a little bit too complex for what they wanted at this stage. So we sort of said, look, you could potentially break this down into two stages. One focused on the property parcel level, and then if required later on, we could sort of start to look at how we're going to integrate the paddock level data. So I should clarify that. So there's the complexity in the data model itself, which is one issue, and then there's also the complexity of obtaining that paddock level data. And I think we sort of felt that while we might be able to pull together some parcel level agricultural property data, being able to obtain a breakdown on a paddock by paddock basis may be a step too far just now. So that's the main motivator towards the two-stage implementation. So the report for the main outcome of this project is currently under review by MLA and PSMA. I unfortunately don't have a date on when that will be publicly released. It shouldn't be too far away. We are actively following it up. It'll be published under an open license, so there shouldn't be any problem sort of picking it apart and sort of seeing, all right, this is what we can really learn from that in the context of this open vineyard mapping project. Brings us on to the final point, I guess, as to where Frontier SI could possibly fit into the open vineyard mapping work that you're looking at the moment. I see the biggest potential opportunities to sort of leverage Frontier SI to support collaboration between our government research and private industry partners. I should have said before that we're not limited to our partners. We do very frequently engage other organisations outside of our partners where necessary. But that first point is really the key involvement that I'd like to see for the open vineyard mapping work. There's certainly some potential to sort of look at how we look at integrating the open vineyard mapping outputs in the agricultural property data model as well, because at some level it'd be expected that there'd be some links between the two. We're certainly not talking about keeping anywhere near the level of data that you will be storing in, like the specifics related to your application don't really have a spot in the more general sort of agricultural property data model, but it would be nice to sort of see how those links between the two could sort of be maintained. Last but not least, I'm a software developer most of the time, so I really like to see these sort of ideas come through to like an implementation. So any sort of technical support, whether it be like basic consultation through to an actual implementation is something that we'd sort of be more than willing to help out with. So that finishes up my presentation. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time this morning. I hope it's been interesting.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Lachlan. We will be absolutely, so Lachlan's been incredibly generous with his time and has a lot of knowledge that we can leverage in the wine industry. And we're also collaborating with a gentleman called Andrew Skinner, who's the head of data at MLA as well. So, you know, they're working very openly like we are. So yeah, hopefully there'll be lots and lots of crossovers. I'm gonna just, in the thought of time, we're going to be moving on now to actually the kind of the practical part of this workshop. So the team that are on Zoom, so Lindsay is going to be taking over for you guys on Zoom, and is going to be running this same session virtually using a Miro board that she's about to share the link to. But basically what we're going to be doing is there are, for everybody who's here in the building, there are two big A0 pictures up on the wall, and there's 3 stations. And what we're wanting you to do is, if you can divide yourself amongst those 3 tables, we would like you to look at those images. One is a top-down view of a vineyard, and one is a kind of a ground view perspective looking along a vine row. And we are wanting you to simply just take 5 minutes individually to think about all of the features of that vineyard which are relevant to you in your role in the wine industry. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit more as we go along for the people that are in the room. I just want you to think about like what actually on this picture is relevant to me and why. There's 5 minutes just to kind of gather your thoughts, and there's Sharpies for everybody on your tables, and just pop them on those Post-it notes. And then the second 5 minutes, we want you as a group to kind of just talk through what's important to you and why. And then for hopefully one person in each team to kind of take the lead with sticking those Post-it notes up on each of those big pictures, and then being ready just to present back to the group what you felt was important to you as geospatial features on each of those images. And the team that are online, you're going to be doing that equally virtually using that Miro board. You'll hear from the 3 groups that are in the room. They're going to be sharing what they felt was important. and then we'll capture everything that's happened online and help to kind of condense and bring everything together and then publish it out for everybody. So I'll go quiet now and we'll mute Zoom so Lindsay can take over from the virtual side.
Okay, thanks all. Everyone you can feel free to unmute and chat during this session, because otherwise it's just going to be me talking to myself. So I have shared it with everyone 2 links. So the first one is this, this view of the vineyard, and then the second one is the top down. If everyone has used, or probably, I don't know if anyone's used Miro before, but anyone, I think you'll be prompted to create a login, so you can do that and create access. And then we were just going to use, over on the left-hand side, there's these sticky notes. So you can just like pick up a sticky note and then put this here and then just start typing all of the elements. But the way that we can also do it as well. So if anyone wants to just click the link and just start adding your own, then that's totally fine. But the other thing that we can do is just call them out, and we can just add them together as we go. So does anyone want to start with an easy one?
Still trying to access.
Okay, access Miro. All right, I'll give everyone a couple of minutes then.
You could probably start with things like strainers and power lines in the background as well, end rows.
Okay, just slow down. I don't even know what a strainer is. What's a strainer?
So they're the big thick posts at the end of the rows.
The big what?
Thick posts at the end of the row.
So like there's these ones, these guys?
That's a strainer, yep.
Ah, I had no idea. And what does a strainer tell us?
Where the end of the row is.
Yep. Row number or just end of row?
And row number.
And row number, yep. Anything else?
I can see some power lines in the background, but...
Yep. All right. So a power line's something that you would typically map out, or like how, I mean, I know where identify. Yep. So they're like a general hazard.
Lindsay, another one would be the dripper line and the diameter and output. Often when you've got a blocks, you know, we've got different dripper systems. So it's always helpful to have some information on what outputs and diameters and all that sort of stuff when you're doing irrigation repairs.
Okay, so the output is that like
litres per hour.
Litres per hour, yep.
Yep. And then dripper emitter spacings and things like that. You know, that's always very helpful.
So when you're doing, say, like when you're creating a map of that, like they're just like, these are sort of just paper maps that you have locally?
Well, like we have a data, we have information on each of the vineyards. So we have that generally in a spreadsheet or something like that.
Yep.
If you could add it in, it'd be handy.
Yep. Okay, excellent. It's done. And that's throughout the entire, like every single row, and then there's connectivity between? Yeah,
you've got your mains and your sub-mains, and
yep.
Then you have your laterals, which are your actual drippers, and your emitters, or your emitters are in your dripper line, or have been plugged in. So yeah, that sort of information is just general information. But you know, when you're actually got 10 different blocks and they've got you know different irrigation systems, it gets a bit confusing at times.
Yeah.
Nigel, would you include install date on there somewhere?
What date?
The install date. So you've actually got an awareness of how old the infrastructure may be.
Yeah, that would be handy. I mean, a lot of people wouldn't have it. I mean, if you're buying vineyards, you generally don't have that information. But yeah, any of that stuff is useful. There's no doubt. Mm-hmm. Most of the vineyards now that are 20 years old, the vineyard irrigation system's pretty knackered. So, yeah.
It's just, you kind of don't want to know.
No.
Don't tell me how old it is. Just tell me when it's broken.
Yeah,
great.
Just tell me when it's thing.
Excellent. Oops. Okay, we can't move these guys too much.
Lindsay,
mm-hmm.
Lindsay, it's Rob Bramley speaking. Can I suggest that we segregate things a little bit in terms of the intended application,
Mhm.
because you don't necessarily need to map everything in the image for all potential applications.
Mhm.
I think I couldn't see who that was talking just now. I think it might have been Nigel, but
Yep.
if you want to do a general survey of all of the vineyard's infrastructure, then obviously mapping strainer posts and the irrigation and things of that sort that Nigel was talking about is obviously very important. But if you're wanting to, for example, assess the productivity of the vineyard, then you'd be more interested in understanding what's happening in the land surface as a whole. So whilst I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that any of the things that Nigel mentioned are not important, they're important for different purposes.
Mhm.
And so you don't necessarily need to have a map that includes everything in the vineyard for some applications, whereas for other applications that would be very useful. So I just can't help thinking that sort of a bit of a segregation of tasks might help with all of this.
Yeah.
Or even some kind of like, I guess like a drop down list option that if you had all the details in the system that you could choose which ones you were after for
Yep.
any
Sure.
job.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And so you
and
have an irrigation set up and then you have everything else.
Yeah, I think really the key is building out this is part of the difference between wanting to kind of pull back and not say here is a database structure as such, but rather these are the common standards, and then you can take that and extend on it. So for the drip irrigation and for that sort of stuff, if that's important to some, then how you would define the data that you're collecting for those things should still fit in with this kind of broader vision that you're referring to, Rob. So with that in mind, let's put a couple of those sort of key top level elements down.
So I would say that the first thing that you need to have for just about any application is the block boundary.
Mm-hmm.
And in relation to what Lachlan was just talking about, I'm talking about the block boundary in the context of the productive area of the land. So typically that's going to be defined by the location of the strainer posts, and you'd probably define it on the basis of this image here that you've just moved to now.
Yep. Can we just talk about, just the block boundary of the productive area of the land. Can you just talk about that a little bit more, like specifically what you mean?
Well, for example, you're not growing anything in the headlands. So in a precision viticulture context, given that we've done a bit of vineyard surveying in that context, we would typically survey the block boundary on the basis of the end posts, the strainer posts. And then there's a bit of debate depending on personal preference as to whether or not down the sides, so the rows at the edge, whether or not you add a little bit of slop on the thing to account for the fact that the canopy is wider than the row as defined by the cordon wire, for example. So some people will tend to sort of add an arm's length, if you like, to the width of the overall block. But for example, if you want to buy imagery, you want to look at that in the context of the productive area of the block in terms of analysing it. And the reason for that is that for example, in that image that you've got there, that block where you're writing cordon wire right now might, for the sake of our example, be planted to Chardonnay, and the one immediately to the east of it might be planted to Shiraz. And the two might have a different canopy structure as well. So you need to look at the images for those two blocks discretely rather than together.
Yep. So where is the cordon wire? That sounds like
It's
something
the thing
that we want to...
the vine cordon is going along.
Is that something that's worth identifying? And is that every, you forgive my ignorance, but is every wire called a cordon wire, or is that just specifically on the edge boundary that you refer to that?
No, you've got different wires. So the cordon wire is where the actual fruit is produced.
Yeah.
And then the wires are catch wires or whatever. I mean, when we're looking at doing yield estimation, we really need to know the number of vines that are bearing. So canopy gaps and things like that. If we're talking block, we then need to look at how many vines are in that block that are actually bearing. So do a yield estimation, we know our vine numbers. So we're not working on that area, we're working on actual productive vines, I guess. So if you know how many gaps I've got in my vineyard, I mean, we've got a 25-acre vineyard, a 10-hectare vineyard, and there's 57% of the vines bearing. So it becomes quite difficult to manage. A lot of older vineyards, you've got a lot of gaps. So that cordon, the actual productive cordon, is something that's quite valuable.
So sorry, I'm just not quite clear. So so across you've got the rows, and then that top, like, is it the top wire that's actually like effectively holding the fruit? That's the cordon wire, and then the other
See
wire.
where your arrow, where your pointer is?
Yeah.
That's the cordon there, where your arrow is.
Right.
Yep. Vine structure, the arms of the vine are.
Yep.
That's the cordon wire.
Yep. Okay, that's good. Okay, great. Okay, excellent. That's good.
So Lindsay, just following on from what I was saying before, once you've got the block boundary, that then helps you define the headlands. And in terms of property level management, I'm sure vineyard managers would like to have maps of their headlands and the roads and so on and so forth. But you'd be interested in those for a slightly different reason than you would be interested in the productive area, for example.
Another thing that you may want to point out on your maps, depending on what task is being completed, is where an irrigation valve might be in a block, going back to, I guess, that hazard side of things. So if there's a valve that you may want a harvester or an undervine weeder or anything like that to miss, just so that the operator knows it's coming up.
Okay, I'll just pull up this image, which we will kind of come back to, but I thought this was a good one from Lachlan's presentation, where this sort of gives you that schema of hierarchy, and we'll have a bit of a thing of doing this shortly. But where a property identification code, and then the address information. So this is where you say go from high level. Kind of interested in, so we're mapping, I'm interested in, you've got the vineyard, especially people that have multiple vineyards. So what is the geolocation address that you take per vineyard? Is there a particular building, or do you move the GPS and have, like, how do you tell what the actual address is for a vineyard?
Usually from the main gate where you enter the vineyard, which is, usually Google, you can use on Google Maps or one of those. You find the main entrance to where the dwelling or the main access. That's usually where we get the vineyard address from.
Yep. Okay.
I don't know what other people do, but that's how we would normally work it.
Yep. So it's that road kind of gate level. Cool. I'll put that in there because I think that's useful. All right. Excellent. So we have.
Sorry, I was going to say, what about the definition of a block versus a sub-block, and having those definitions between different either varieties, ages, management zones, or something like that?
Yeah, look, that's actually, it's kind of this one here. I just want to, sorry, this is up. I've just lost internet connection. This isn't quite, I don't quite want it like this, but, and I'm just going to do sticky notes just because it's fast, but let's talk a little bit about that. So so you're talking block and then you're talking sub block. Because I think that this stuff from kind of part of what I've been thinking about quite a bit is, okay, so we know that a block may be we know that a block's a geographical area, but we also know that block might change over time. And then I wonder, when you like sell that block to the winemaker, how are you defining it? Like, what are the attributes that you say, this is a block, this is the information about it that goes beyond the geography? So I think that's where you're starting to go with that point.
Correct. I'm just intrigued to see what people's thoughts are in how they actually define that.
My view would be you define a block as a collection of rows and, more importantly, a collection of vines, because I can be selling a block 1 year to parts of it to 2 different wineries, and then next year I'll sell different combinations of rows to a different winery. And then I may choose to convert part of that block to another variety or do something else with it. So the smallest unit that we can manage, I think, becomes very important. And currently we can identify rows. And if you want to take it all the way back to the nursery, we could potentially identify vines as making up those rows.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's and I think that kind of gets into the crux of how blocks are used, how blocks are considered from, how blocks are considered in an active work way, and then almost the difficulty of, like, how do you maintain a comparison if you're looking at a geographical area to see how well fruit is growing when you might have changed the composition of that block as you're thinking about it? So what are kind of the elements that you're recording so that you can do some comparison? Anyone?
Well, you get feedback from the winery. I'm not sure we're going with it, Lindsay, in the relevance to mapping, but you will get feedback from the winery or winemakers on the performance of the fruit that you've sold them, whether that's from a whole block or parts of a block.
Mm-hmm.
Probably one of the most relevant forms of assessment.
Okay.
I guess if you're looking for specifics too, that's where that, I guess, clonal data may be important in dividing up parcels too.
So, sorry, did you just say clonal data?
Yeah, so if you've got different clones in one block, that may sometimes be how someone separates things. So yeah, just different vine clones.
Yeah. Okay. So that is getting down to the vine level. Okay, so I'm just going to put some of those.
Everybody who's online, we're going to be just to let you know, in about a minute's time, we're going to ask each of the 2 groups here just to share like some of the geospatial features that they see are as important. So yeah, if you can bear with us in about a minute, we'll be with you.
Okay. All right. Does anyone want to make sure that we have added all the geospatial features?
I think we're probably missing mid-rows.
Okay, mid-rows.
Within that.
I think there's also probably a need to identify all the infrastructure and buildings, tanks, all that type of thing probably on the other map is more relevant. But
yeah, potentially. I don't know if we said it as well, but yeah, vine and row spacings.
Yep. Hang on. All right, I'll just do. And then the vine and row spacings. So when we did the survey, it was about 50-50 of people that just seemed to have very consistent row spacings across their entire vineyard, and then people that had variable spacings. I assume that there's generally consistency across a block, but then maybe different blocks across the vineyard tend to change.
Yes.
One more you might like to add is sensors or specific equipment within each row at certain locations.
Yep. Okay. How do we think we're going? That's pretty good. Buildings and dams.
You probably need to indicate a specific starting point for the row. So which direction are you counting or are you working from? and also which direction are you numbering the rows as well.
Okay, everybody. So thank you for bearing with us, everybody online. I'm going to go to Group A, and hopefully there is a speaker in this first group that we will hand the microphone to, and they will take the lead. Introducing yourself, and then if you can talk through what your group has identified as the key kind of features that you can see in each of these two images.
Hans Loader, Vineyard Manager from Coonawarra at Penleigh Estate. Yeah, Vineyard Manager from Coonawarra at Penleigh Estate. Our group discussed everything from the macro to the micro level and settled on, in the end, only got 4 of these, but seeing boundary is critical. The row, name, and then seeing how blocks are broken up also by variety. We saw, in talking some of these macro features, things such as drainage lines, contours, leaning to larger features such as the dam there, and then in the vineyard specific features, really the rows, headlands, distinction between a headland area and the vineyard area, and at what point a boundary would be defined by the end of what is the vineyard and what might be then deemed as something as a headland or a boundary area.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Hans. And what we'll do is we'll take pictures, and we'll get some higher resolution pictures of each of these images and help to share these after the workshop. So, and then we'll come over to Group B. So if one of you can step up to and take the mic. Thank you. And if you can introduce yourself there, Ben.
G'day, I'm Ben Castine from grower from the Clare Valley. We sort of discussed a whole heap of different aspects, but just probably more from the big macro physical aspects. Again, whole block boundary, watering patch boundaries if they're split up into different patches per block. Any gaps in the vineyards, and I guess row numbers obviously pretty important. Irrigation valve positions are really important for, particularly for contractors that aren't familiar with vineyards, and at harvest time they can be a bit problematic. So that's quite a good one to identify as well. Position of the irrigation risers, which generally I think probably run in the middle of the vineyards and spread outwards, is important if you're doing any undervine cultivation. And yeah, a whole heap of other ones that that are important as well, but probably they're the most important ones that we identified. So yeah.
Thank you very much there, Ben, and thank you also for travelling down from Clare all the way down to Adelaide for us today. So we will help to share that and also share what's come from Lindsay's group online. So we have about 15 minutes left because we'll be finishing at 11 o'clock. I just wanted to, just to start with, if you don't mind, Lindsay, just stopping sharing your screen, I think. I'm just going to share screen from here. So actually, the conversation here already started to advance to people questioning and debating like some of the definitions of some of the key features of a vineyard. And this is what we're wanting as our second exercise. This is just kicking things off, and this will all continue online. But there's a number of basically things that we would like you to actually stop and write down your interpretation and definition of them. So actually, like, what would you define as a vineyard? Like, how would you define a vineyard? What does it have on it? What is it? What isn't it? Probably a harder one, like, what does a vineyard block mean to you? So, like, why do you divide things into vineyard blocks? What makes a vineyard block? And then also thinking about what is a vine row. So if you can start to think about defining, okay, like, yeah, what is a vine row? And coming back to blocks, like, do you ever divide a vineyard block into a smaller area, into kind of a sub block? And, you know, if you do divide it, why do you divide it? And what do you call it? So if there is something smaller than a vineyard block, and it might be that a vineyard block is made up of certain different areas of grapes actually become a block, like what do you call those other smaller areas? Or are they just all a part of a vineyard block? So we're really interested to kind of learn how you name things. And lastly, what information about a vineyard block, so what kind of metadata is important to you? So again, I won't lead this. We'll just let you think about when you're thinking about your vineyard blocks, like what is it about that vineyard block that's actually like that's tagged along with it, you know? So I won't say anything. I'll just see what comes from you guys. So we're going to, again, Lindsay's going to take over online using a Miro board she'll share. And then we have some big pieces of paper that we're going to pass out to you. These are all the questions that we're going to ask you to try and define. So again, just probably just take a couple of minutes just to scribble some initial thoughts for each of you on some of these key questions. And then we'll put on some big pieces of paper. And if you can actually, as a group, try your best within the time we've got to write down a definition. And again, this is only a starting point today. So this will continue, but this is the place to kick it off. Okay, thank you. So the online team will be back with you in approximately 10 minutes time.
I am here. I'll just, let me just make some little stickies for and then I'll do block metadata or block features. Okay, so I'll just share my screen. Yeah, I'll share my screen. Okay, cool. So this will sort of, I'll just put these in sticky notes just for ease of setting this up. But then these will kind of be like those structural elements that were a little bit more in line with that Frontier SI kind of schema example. So we'll kind of break these down. So vineyard, what defines a vineyard? So I'll just start this off. So we had a geolocation address, which was the front gate. Address. Anything else?
At its simplest, it's a collection of blocks.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's great. Yep. Yep.
The property boundary.
Sorry, property boundary. Yep.
Property boundary.
Yep. Okay, excellent. And then a block, we had defined that as a collection of rows.
Yep.
And a collection of vines.
Well, it's a management unit.
Mm-hmm. A management unit as defined by how?
Well, for example, it might be planted to a single variety.
Mm-hmm.
Or it might deliberately have been designed to be a certain size so that assuming the yield target is met, it delivers the right amount of fruit to fill up X number of tanks at the winery.
Mm-hmm.
Question, is a block generally have a physical separation to other blocks?
No. You mean, does it have a headland between one block and another one? Or
Yes. Yeah.
No.
Doesn't have to, but it might have.
Mm-hmm. So then how often do blocks change within a vineyard? So how often would you say we've now, decommissioned a block essentially and we've created new blocks, or like are they static, are they variable?
So the capital cycle of a vineyard is typically 30 years. But
Okay.
could well be a lot longer.
So we'd expect that block boundaries wouldn't change within 30 years, but the
wouldn't
features
expect
of a block might.
Yeah, because you might graft a subsection of it to something else.
Okay.
Nigel, you're talking, but you're on mute.
Oh.
Sorry, the vine, you know, you might change a block where there's a really high vigor section and a low vigor section.
Okay.
So it doesn't change very often.
Okay. So is that going to be a feature of a block, like the vigor count, the vigor score, whatever it is?
Depends,
Is that?
depends what it depends if you're in a commercial situation, say a Riverland vineyard where you've got big volumes of selling to multiple organisations, or you're a small producer in a premium area like the Barossa. It's not going to change generally. People generally buy that age, that block which is of a certain age or a certain clone or whatever. But commercial, bigger commercial vineyards in the Riverland, for instance, will probably have a very different outlook to what we would as a small premium producer.
I think your management practices can change more so than the actual definitions of that block.
Yep. Okay.
And whilst you're typing in the block features thing, you'd want to note the row and the vine spacing in there.
And potentially
the variety and the clone.
And potentially style of trellis too.
Yep.
Style of trellis. So that's something that's useful.
Yes.
Yeah.
It may be a trellised block. It may be I guess a single cordon, bicordon. It may be a bush vine. And the way that you manage that will be defined by trellis in some instances.
If you're spraying a block which is a 2-wire vertical, you're going to need a more water volume, for instance, than a single wire or a bush vine. So that'll affect your management.
Okay, great. So what about at the vine or row level? What are we wanting? Oh, at the vine row level.
Well, you want to know bearing vines, or metre of cordon bearing, or how many misses are in a row.
Vine spacing, again.
Vine spacing, yeah.
Length of rows.
Yep.
If you know the area of the vineyard based on the block boundary and just divide that by the row spacing, then you know what the length of row in the block is. So there's some fairly simple and well understood mathematics of a vineyard that give you a lot of these characteristics.
And that's always helpful when you're retrellising, like a lot of us are doing at the moment. So, if you're retrellising for Utica, you need to know how many metres of wire you need and all those sort of things for retrellising. The lines, all those sort of things are very useful.
You may also want an orientation of the vine row, and you may also want to indicate which is the primary or the end you start measuring things from, often where the road is accessed.
Okay, I think is that going to be on a per block basis?
Yeah.
Just move these guys over here. Okay. So Lachlan, is that flowing out nicely for you as a way to really turn all of this into a nice, clean data model? Oh, no, I lost it. I guess you can, yeah, you can sort of, so these are the things that'll start to kind of come out over the next couple of workshops where we are in some ways following this, where we've got some sort of identification, which is probably the vineyard name, the address, things like the management entities, which for us are the blocks, and then the vines. There's use. So the use that we've got are things like variety. What are the other kind of I guess, yeah, use or metadata things that you would then use or sell or pass on? So I think we had like age planted or date planted.
Age of vines.
Yep. Age of vines as a per row.
No. Just the date of planting's fine.
Yep.
I'm just saying the age of the vines.
Yeah. And is the date of planting, is that like realistically, is that per row?
Per block.
No, per block.
Yeah. Okay.
And that data is very, for old vineyards, it's more subjective than objective. It's not objective. It's generally guessed over the years.
Is there anything else like as a management unit? So when you're selling, so say you're selling a block to a vineyard, to a winemaker, what other information are you telling them? So you'll be telling them the variety, the date of planting, the age of the grape.
Clone.
Pardon?
The clone.
The clone. So is the clone different from the variety?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. How so? So what's a clone?
Well, it's like having a Dalmatian versus a Doberman.
Okay. Yeah. So it's like the breed.
Yeah.
And what are the elements that make up a clone then?
So a clone comes originally. So you've got Shiraz, say for all Shiraz. A clone is a selection from an individual plant within a vineyard. So they propagate from that particular selection.
Online, but we're going to be wrapping up here in about a minute's time and starting to share things. Thanks so much, Lindsay.
That's okay. Yeah, so I guess what I'm getting at is, okay, so say we know that we have, so that this is a clone of the Shiraz, but is it a clone of a plant that was taken from a specific location? Like when you're looking at something and you're like, oh, this is a clone from here. Is it a clone from within the vineyard, or is it a clone that, yeah, where's that clone start from?
The clone starts, so the industry used 1654. That is vine 1654 from the Newry Research Station. So we generally get our planting material from vine selection societies. Mm-hmm. So they have a range of clones that they sell of Shiraz, for instance. So basically, at the time, you might plant 2 or 3 clones or 1 clone. Mm-hmm. So generally some clones have bigger bunches, some have smaller bunches. So it's really a selection of Shiraz. Mm-hmm. And, they do have different characteristics. So sometimes winemakers will look for one characteristic over another.
Okay.
So it's not the most important thing, but it's something that people look at.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, look, I think that yeah, that's interesting. It's sort of mapping of variety, but then also mapping of characteristics, because it does seem to become those characteristics, or at least those growing property types, that when you do start to go into more prescription agriculture, you're trying to replicate those conditions to support certain characteristics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool. And when you tie this information in with vigor, for a very vigorous section, you might put
Okay, thank you so much to everybody online. We're just wrapping up here, Lindsay, if you just want to get your last thoughts together. So we've got table B. So if we can have quiet, everybody. So we're going to go to table B first. And again, obviously, like we said before, this is very much just kicking off this conversation. And we will continue this debate on collaboraculture.com. And, this is something that we have to reach consensus on. and we have to collaborate to get towards. But hopefully this will start to spark some of those discussion topics which will pop online. So Ben, if you can introduce yourself and then start to just talk through how you define, what is a vineyard, what information about a vineyard block is important to you, and so Frank, maybe go across in a logical way. So what is a vineyard? What is a vineyard block next? Over to you, Ben.
Okay, yeah, Ben Mitchell, Taylor's Wines, viticulturalist in the Clare Valley. So the first question is, what is a vineyard? We've got a few definitions here: a property or a number of farms, a continuous, a vineyard is strainer post, intermediate post, drippers, and is a zone of the block. And a vineyard can be just a difference in ownership or manager. What is a vineyard block? So it's an individual patch of grapevines, clear geospatial boundary to other blocks. What is a block? It's a sub area of a vineyard defined by variety, quality, vigor, soil type. And the block could be differences in physical structure and access, could be i.e. just a crete line for different zone.
Question, so when you've got, when some of your blocks at Taylor's Wines, when blocks actually have even smaller areas of grapes that make up a block that maybe aren't absolutely together, how do you know those smaller areas?
Yeah, so we, specifically, we've got bays, so we've got old contoured vineyards. We may have 5 bays that make up one block, so that adds an extra layer of complexity, I guess. So what is a vine row? It's a continuous linear swath of vines, and a vine row is a continuous canopy or vines in a operational orientation. I'll move on to the next one. What information about a vineyard block is important? So the year it was planted, variety, clone, rootstock, row space, vine spacing, valve flow rate, how many irrigation zones you have, type of trellis, row height, height of intermediate post. We want to know the average yield, flow rate to dripper spacing, row orientation, row numbering, the number of gaps we have in that vineyard, missing vines. And yeah, I think that's about it.
Thank you, Ben. There's loads there, especially about how the metadata you want to associate with the vineyard block. So thank you so much for that. And then we will move over to Team A. So if we can step through this. So if you can, Hans, maybe start with like how you guys defined a vineyard. So what is a vineyard for you?
Yeah, I think, thanks Ben and Group B, I think you've there's a lot of commonality. I think our group, we're really focused on that it's a grouping of vines, which is dedicated to the growing, which may or may not be dedicated to the growing of grapes, like solely, but there can be other things going on in there, as we're seeing more often, but primarily dedicated to the production of grapes. I like the wording here, usually grouped together. So we were talking about bush vines versus that next thing about what is a sub-block and what is a vine row. So moving on to what features and what is a block. So yes, we definitely do talk in a sub area with blocks, and that may be grouped based on variety. It may be grouped due to irrigation sections or other features. So typically starting vineyard, then going to block, and then even going to sub-block areas, and the sub-blocks being divided into your rows, vines, panels, and whatever that whatever the feature is that you're looking for in the feature of significance. And again, talking about a vine row, pretty much saying, look, it's a linear feature of vines. conceptual first post to last post. And then within that, within a vine row is features which are necessary in terms of managing a vineyard as well. So your variety clone, the vine within a row, the vine number, the vine spacing, post spacing, number of panels, and even also down to a GPS position of a particular feature. So it's sort of in the time we had available, thinking from the overall vineyard right down to a GPS coordinate and a single point.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. No, thank you guys. I know that that was, we didn't have a lot of time available to get those initial thoughts down. So just wrapping up, because we've got to stop just for everybody online. We promised that we would stop by 11 o'clock Adelaide time. So what we will do is we will take pictures of all of these and also help to transcribe them all. So we'll post that at, on collaboraculture.com and link to it in a follow-up email. And also capture everything that Lindsay and the group online have also done. And then we will liaise with, we've got kind of 5 or 6 different key partners, Vine Health being one, and Pete and Help from Vine Australia, and a number of key growers. We'll again, over between this workshop and the next workshop, we will do our best to pull together the definitions that we got to people and kind of put some draft thoughts out to folks, and also kind of put some questions if we can see any potential holes in any ways that it's been defined by the group. So that will be like our deliverable as a project, as a next step. The next workshop is going to be on the 30th of October. So whereas this has been a bit more conceptual, and we will summarize it as we said, the next workshop is going to be much more logical. So we will actually, and we're also going to have some people coming in and talking about the learnings from the mining industry, a bit like Emily did from Streets. We're going to have somebody coming, Shay's going to come in and talk about like how they've approached this kind of area of standards and creating a model from a mining perspective. So yeah, so if you look out for that, that'll be on the 30th of October. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. And appreciate that that was quite a whistle-stop tour of that last section. So thank you. And yeah, please look out for emails from us. There is also a survey, we've put a Survey Monkey out. I think Lindsay will just share that link and we'll send it out to everybody just to capture some more information about people's vineyard blocks, just so that we actually build up this better picture of actually how vineyard blocks are made up and some of the nuances of them, so that these definitions are like properly considered. So you can take 5 minutes to do that Survey Monkey. That would be great as well. So thank you so much. Take care and see you on the 30th.
Thanks all.